Coming up, a new eHarlem TV program, Harlem Speaks, a series of conversations examining issues impacting community residents.
Our subject, the 2010 Census. We've invited two informed sources to help us understand the numbers in terms of what they mean to us as a community and as a nation. Our guests are Paul Taylor, Executive Director of the Pew Hispanic Center, and Walter Fields, the Executive Editor of the NorthStarNews.com. Gentlemen, welcome to eHarlem Speaks. Basically, I'd like to put some context to it by beginning by talking about what the numbers are in the city and what they are in East Harlem. Take a look at this. In the city, we're about 8.1 million, 33% white, 22% black, 28% Hispanic, 12% Asian. New York remains a majority-minority town. That's one side of it. First question becomes, is the majority-minority town a look to the future of what the rest of the country might look like in the next 10 to 20 years? What do you think, Paul?
Absolutely. That is baked into our demographic reality, our demographic destiny. We've done population projections sometime between 2040 and 2050, 30 or so years down the road, we will be a majority-minority country. This is mostly the result of a very large immigration wave that's about 40 years old now. We've about 40 million immigrants have come to this country since 1965. About half of them are Latino, about 25% are Asian, and the remainder are European or African. Very different from our earlier immigration waves of the late 19th and early 20th century. They too were very large. They were almost entirely white and European. So it's immigration that is changing the face of America, and increasingly it is the children of the immigrants who are accounting for the population growth. From 2000 to 2010, for example, 90% of the population growth in this country was non-white. It was mostly Latino, Asian, African American.
The spike in Hispanic numbers are through the roof.
And it's not immigration any longer. That was the story of the 80s and 90s. Increasingly, it's the children of immigrants. So a lot of this is baked in. If you look at births today, births around the country in 2011, a majority of them are non-white. So this is where we're going as a country.
And there are also more native-born minority children being born to particularly the Mexican community, which is driving the growth across the country.
Very much so. The history of immigrants throughout our history, I think throughout the world, is immigrants typically move for economic opportunity. Immigrants typically have a lot of kids. They believe in the future. They believe in it enough that they uprooted themselves, left something familiar, went to something new, wanted to reach for opportunity, and one expression of that is you have a lot of kids. And we see that certainly in the Latino community at large, particularly the Mexican American.
You know, it's interesting, Walter, it's the black population in New York City is 22%, it's down 5%. They're moving south.
We're seeing the reverse migration from the Great Migration, that African Americans are returning back south. And I think it's a fascinating story. And I really get excited when I walk through New York City, because you didn't have to wait for these numbers to know that there was great change. I mean, for the last 10 years, you could walk through this city and you could see it and you could hear it and you could feel it. And I think it's really exciting what the city is going through. And I think you're absolutely right. This is a trend that we're going to see roll over throughout the country. The black community in New York is very interesting. You know, my mother was part of the Great Migration that moved from North Carolina up to New Jersey. And now most of my relatives are looking back south because there's a sense of security in the South. Despite the issues, despite the past of Jim Crow, the South means something to African Americans. And while they are going back, we're seeing this large increase in the Hispanic population, as you said, particularly the Mexican population.
But what amazes me is they're moving to states like North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Nevada. And in terms of the Hispanics, I mean, you got the granddaddy of them all, New Mexico, about 49%, you know, Latino, who have just elected their second Latino governor. I mean, is that the wave of the future in terms of movement of numbers attaining political power?
I think for the African American community, we're going to see more of the reverse migration. You know, when you talk to African Americans, there's a sense that there is less opportunity in the industrial Northeast states. So places that became havens for African Americans during the Great Migration, Detroit, Gary, Newark, New Jersey, you're beginning to see those numbers decrease significantly. And I think it's because you're going back to familiar places, despite the fact that we know that there are still issues around racism and discrimination in the South. I think African Americans feel comfortable with going back to a place that their ancestors were, and also knowing that there's a large population. So when you start looking at the southern states, when you look at Maryland, which is now, 35, 40% African American, South Carolina.
But are they moving because the Northeast corridor, the manufacturing corridor, is basically moving out? All those populations, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they're losing population, and people have to go places where there are jobs.
They're certainly moving for economic reasons, but I suspect that in the African American, it's a cultural reason too. There is this sense of oneness with the South. My mother's been up north since the 1940s, but she never considered New Jersey home. North Carolina was always home, and that's with many African Americans from that age group and their children. So many of my cousins, many people my age are moving to places like Charlotte, Columbia, South Carolina,
it's become a hub.
Atlanta. They've become hubs, but they've become hubs because there's a sense that's where we are supposed to be. And given the economic changes in the Northeast, why stay in a place where there's less economic opportunity? So when you're looking at your children, you're trying to find that place that is most comfortable.
Well, let me just say that East Harlem may be one of those places. Just let me run some numbers on where we are with East Harlem. We're talking about 120,000 people. White population is 12%, but it's spiked by 68%. Over 5,000 people in the last 10 years have moved into East Harlem. The black population is 31%, down 10%. They're moving out as well. The Hispanic, this has been overwhelmingly, an overwhelming Hispanic Latino community, 49%, down 3%. The growth people here are basically the Asians. Now, what we're really describing here, it seems to me, is a community in the midst of change, development going on, new people coming in, enriching the economy. What does that how do you see that in terms of the long term for communities like East Harlem?
Well, I think whites that are economically able are beginning to look at neighborhoods like East Harlem and understand the attributes. All you have to do is wake up in the morning and listen to the traffic report and say, something, I don't want to commute for an hour and a half to get to work. And so we're seeing that in places like Washington, D.C. All of a sudden outside of Washington, D.C., you had Montgomery County, Prince George's County, you're seeing an influx of whites back into the District of Columbia because they understand it's a better quality of life if you can live in a place and work in a place and not have to worry about commuting. The issue becomes, of course, economics and education.
Well, how about the issue of the old-timers here? They look at themselves and they say, can I stay here? Can I afford to stay here?
That's one of this process is sometimes called gentrification, and there are winners and losers in any kind of economic and demographic change. And I think the old timers who get moved out, who suddenly see that the rents are double what they were, that may be a downside. But there is plenty of upside, and it's not just the sense of economic revival. My guess would be that the increase in the white population in a neighborhood like this, and as Walter was saying in Washington, D.C., where I live, is mostly young. And it does
voting age.
Yeah, it does reflect the reality that we are undergoing a profound demographic change in this country. As we talked about earlier, we're becoming a majority-minority country. I think for people, older people, particularly older whites, that is disorienting. It's not the country they were born into. It's not the way they think of America. For a teenager and a 20-something, that's the only America they've known, and it's absolutely, and the notion of diversity, rather than being seen as some sort of challenge, is being seen as sort of the wallpaper of their lives in the country, and there's just much more comfort with it. So I would take that as a hopeful signal.
And I think that's an important point, because I think there's a level of consciousness there that didn't exist in some of these places when you did have sort of whites and blacks living next to each other. And I think this younger generation sees it not as something peculiar, but as something that they grew up with. So you have young white professionals who don't have a problem living anywhere in New York City because that's the life that they have led from birth. So it can be an exciting change. I think the reconciliation part comes in what happens to the indigent population that's been there forever.
Please visit us on the web at eHarlemTV.com, where you could tell us what you think about our program, as well as access any of our stories. Paul, let me just swing for a moment into the issue of economics. And one of your headlines were that Hispanics have overtaken whites in poverty, while the white population is 63% of the country, and the Hispanic population is only 6%. How does that happen?
Well, it is a fascinating statistic, and permit me a small anecdote. I'm a former newspaper reporter. I used to cover political campaigns, and in the 1980s, I covered both of Jesse Jackson's campaigns. And he would talk about economic justice, and he would talk about poverty. But he recognized that poverty is not an easy subject for most Americans to listen to and hear about. It's somebody else's problem. And particularly, I think his calculation was if an African American is talking about poverty, I think it's my people's problem. So he would say, in campaign stop after campaign stop, to white audiences, he would say, you know, most poor people in this country are not black. Most poor people in this country are white. This is a problem that we all share.
That was always it.
That was always it, because at that point, still today, blacks are about 12% of the population. So in sheer numbers alone, poverty is there are more whites in poverty. Well, now fast forward to 2011, that is no longer the case. The largest number of children in poverty today are Hispanics. And partly that is a reflection of this enormous population bulge.
Is that 6 million or so?
6 million. And it's 1.5 million more than the next largest group, which is white and then black. Now, poverty rates in the black community, childhood poverty rates, remain the highest. They're close to 40% in the black community. They're about 35% in the Latino community, much lower in the white community. So the rates are much higher in both minority communities. But you get back to the notion of demography is destiny. These kids and the circumstances that these kids are growing up in is not just a problem for the Latino community or the African American community. These kids are the workforce of the future. These kids are the workers who are going to pay the Social Security benefits of the predominantly white.
Well, Social Security, we'll make that for another day. But
the point is very simple. This is everybody's issue, and the numbers, I think, make that plain. If you live in California, you know it's your issue because the demographic changes happen. Texas, you move through the whole Southwest. A city like New York understands it as well.
What do you think? Well, I always have a link between the poverty levels and the education levels. I mean, and the job employment rates. And when we take a look at it today, I mean, you know, we just missed this. We just after this great recession, and the unemployment rate, let's say, for the white community is a little bit above 8, 16 for the black community, over 12. You know, for the Hispanic community, how do we survive all of that, given that everybody is struggling so much, just trying to find a job and/or put food on their table in a community like here in East Harlem?
Well, that's the question, whether or not we will survive. I mean, right now we're drowning, and I think what was very interesting about Reverend Jackson's campaigns, because I was on his '88 campaign staff, poverty is an American problem. And unfortunately, because we have sort of wrapped race and ethnicity around it, we haven't been able to deal with it truthfully. But the real truth of the matter is, as you said, if we don't do something about it, particularly among a growing Hispanic population, African American children, we're all going to pay in the long term. So at some point, we have to have a truthful conversation.
Have, for decades, refused to invest on the inner city educational systems. Mortimer Adler, one fellow used to say, the fight for the 21st century is going to be fought in the inner city classrooms, and who educates the best will win in the global marketplace. Is there any substance to that?
Oh, there's a lot of substance to that, but I think we have to unwrap race and ethnicity around it, but then wrap it back around. I mean, it's a very difficult problem to get at because you can see it in certain places, it's in your face, you can't miss it. There are parts of this country, quite frankly, and this is what people forget, after you go West Coast, East Coast, that middle part of America oftentimes has a hard time thinking about these issues in those terms because they don't necessarily see it. One thing Reverend Jackson said, I was in Iowa once, he talked to farmers and he said, you know, black people aren't taking your farms. He says Latinos aren't taking your farms. He says corporations are taking your farms, and more than likely the head of the corporation is a white male. So it's how we really approach these issues. But poverty is one that, unless we do something about it, millions of Americans are going to be affected, not just those impoverished, but the fact that we won't have the workers for our economy. We won't have the tax base to do the things that we agree are sort of national priorities. We won't even have the armed forces. What people don't understand about today's military is you can't be dumb and be in the armed services.
No, you have to have some.
You have to, because it's so high tech today. So where do all these workers come from?
Please join us Saturday, November 19th at La Marqueta on 115th Street and Park Avenue for a clothing and textiles recycling day and receive a free energy-efficient compact light bulb.
I also seem to see a great deal of hope in one of Paul's headlines, where the spike in Hispanic college enrollment is the highest in history.
Yeah, there was a big one-year spike between 2009 and 2010. Literally a 25% increase in the number of Latinos ages 18 to 24, sort of the college-age Latinos, in some form of post-secondary education.
What caused that spike?
Well, I think good news and bad news. The bad news is the lousy economy. These kids couldn't get jobs, and perhaps more so than any other group in the country, you know, until that bad economy, the 18-year-old might get out of high school and go find a construction job and help support his family. Those jobs aren't there. So there's no job. If I can find an inexpensive community college, let me get a credential and let me improve my chances of getting a job down the road. But, and the other spike is simply the demographic bubble. I mean, there's just a lot of young Latinos coming of age.
Overwhelming numbers. You know, the other side of that, Walter, is black enrollment in colleges have gone down. What's that about?
Well, I think a lot of it's about mass incarceration, particularly among young black men. When you see the numbers of young black men who are literally being taken out of communities or incarcerated. I attended a historically black college. You know, it's you know, male and female. But you visit that campus today and it looks like in a women's college because young black men are not going to college. And I think, you know, the fascinating thing about the spike in Hispanic numbers in college, that's a good thing. The problem is we haven't really dealt with discriminatory practices in the labor market. So we have a situation where oftentimes...
Well, we lost the labor movement in America.
We lost the labor movement, but we also haven't dealt with private sector discrimination the way that we should be dealing with it. So you can have a white male with a criminal record have more an advantage getting a job than a black male with a college degree. There's something wrong with that. And until we deal with those types of things, it's going to be very difficult for young Hispanics or young African Americans who do go to college and do all the right things to enter a labor market that historically has been pretty hostile.
So